Okay, let's go.
Share screen.
E, Rafael, você vai fazer uma
Começo.
apresentação?
Good night, everybody. For the Department of Political Science at the University of Sao Paulo, it's an honor to have here Professor David Maris from University of California, San Diego. David Maris is one of these leading researchers today on Latin America in the field of energy politics, political economy, of drug policy, security defense politics, civil military relations, and the use of photography in politics. Professor Mares holds the Institute of the Americas Endowed Chair for Inter-American Affairs at University of California, San Diego. And he is also the Baker Institute Scholar for Latin America Energy Studies at the Shane Baker Wright University. Mares was previously professor of the Centro de Estudios Internacionales en el Colegio de México and has been a Fulbright professor at the Universidad de Chile y visiting professor at Flaxo, Ecuador. Some of his most influential books in what think about Latin America are Violent Peace, Militarized Interstate Bargain in Latin America, published by Columbia University Press, Latin American and the Illusion of Peace, published by Rollesheet, Aspirational Power, Brazil on the Long Road to Global Influence, published by Brookings Institution, and his last book is Reserve Nationalizing and Energy Policy, Venezuela in Contest. This book will be the topic of the lecture. David, thank you very much for your presence here today with us.
Pois, muito obrigado pela invitação. Vou falar no inglês, mas se os estudantes gostam de falar em português, devagar, posso entender. Então, para explicação ou uma questão, podem falar no português. Mas eu vou falar no inglês. So, thank you.
Mas está ótimo seu português, David.
Okay. Can you see my screen? I asked for share screen, but I still see my picture up. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, David.
Okay, so you see the PowerPoint. All right, great. My topic is nationalism and natural resources. As you can see here on the opening page, I've got public companies, national oil companies. There's Equinor, there's Sonatrach, the Algerian one, Equinor, the Norwegian one, a couple of Latin American ones, PDVSA, Petrobras. But it's not just about national oil companies. It's also about private oil companies. You see there's Shell, there's Chevron, there's Total, which at one point was the French national oil company, and now is a private company. And it's not just about oil and gas. I'm going to talk mainly about oil and gas, but here you can see the Bolivian Yacimientos de Litio, Bolivianos, and you can see Codelco, the Chilean copper company. All right, so my discussion about nationalism and natural resources is much bigger than simply about oil and gas, even though most of my examples here will be on oil and gas, because that's what my current book is. But in the question period, if you want to talk about other natural resources, I'm happy to do that as well. All right, so let's start out with, what is the question? What's the question in my research here? Well, there's really two questions. The first is, how does nationalism determine government policy on natural resources? All right, so here we refer to natural resources that are owned by the nation. Okay, most people don't understand this, but oil and gas deposits in every country in the world, except the United States, and except for a few provinces in Canada, oil and gas resources are owned by the nation. They're not private resources, they're owned by the nation. All right. In the US and some Canadian provinces, the surface owner, the person who owns the land on top, also owns the subsoil resources. But that is unique. That is not standard. And usually when people talk about oil and gas industries, oil and gas politics, they assume that Latin America is somehow unique because in Latin America, the subsoil resources are owned by the nation. But that's the norm. That's the rule. It's the US where that's not the norm. All right. So we're referring to subsoil resources that are owned by the nation. Okay. The dominant claim in the literature that looks at subsoil resources and the question of nationalism, the dominant claim is that nationalism leads governments to intervene in the market to affect the terms under which natural resources are exploited. Okay, so because the government owns, well, that's a mistake. Most of the literature does refer to the government owns, but no, the government doesn't own, the nation owns. Okay, so because the nation owns the resources, governments intervene. All right. The second dominant claim in the literature is that when governments intervene, they seek to maximize returns to the government in the immediate term. Right now, that claim is a fundamental claim, and notice how the literature. What do I mean by the literature? I mean most people who are writing, I would say everyone except my book, all right, who are writing about oil and gas politics, make these claims, all right? They go from the government is going to intervene in the market to assuming that the government intervenes to maximize returns to the government, not to the nation, but to the government, and in the immediate term. All right, so that's the dominant paradigm here. All right, now the second question, when we're discussing nationalism and natural resources, the second question is, what is the impact of nationalism on the outcome of government policy? Governments make policy for a variety of reasons. So the question here is, how does the fact of nationalism, okay, affect government policy? For people who believe in free markets, the results are always negative. All right, there's a resource curse because governments intervene in the market. For what I'm calling here statists, statists believe that the government has a responsibility to intervene. For statists, the impact of nationalism on the outcome of government policy is not negative, it's positive. These are positive results for the nation. There's wealth to distribute to citizens, and when governments intervene, they intervene for the benefit of the nation. Now, that last point there about status is what allows people to criticize governments that intervene in the market and do things that don't benefit the nation. The claim there is that the government is violating its responsibility to use the resources for the benefit of the nation. Now that's a key claim, and what I will take you through in today's lecture is that there is no agreement in Latin America on, well, what does it mean to violate that responsibility, and what does it mean to follow that responsibility? So that's what my book is really about, but in order to get there, we have to go through some theory first. Okay. So those are the two big questions in the literature about nationalism and natural resources. All right, so why do we not have a consensus? Why do we not have an agreement on answering these questions? And basically what I argue in the first half of my forthcoming book is that we have a number of problems from an analytical perspective. The very first problem is in defining our terms. Okay, this is a class, so you should know that it's very important if you're doing an analysis to be very precise about what you are talking about, what claims you are making, and how you marshal evidence in support of those claims, right? And my argument in this book is that, in fact, people who claim to be talking about resource nationalism as a good thing or as a bad thing actually have very poor definitions about what is resource nationalism. Here we'll go through the three dominant things that are problematic in the definition of resource nationalism. We don't have a definition of how to identify resource nationalism. How do we know it's there if we can't identify it? Is it any taxes that are imposed on the oil and gas sector or the natural resource sector? Is that what resource nationalism is? Some authors will say yes. They'll say, oh, taxes are rising and that's because of resource nationalism. All right. Or is it regulations on access to the resource, on production of the resource, on what today is called ESG, environment, social issues, and governance issues? Is that what we mean by resource nationalism? For other people, the resource nationalism is about policies that contribute to state resources. Okay, so if the government is undertaking any policy that contributes to state resources, that by definition is resource nationalism. For others, it's not policies that contribute to state resources, but only those policies that contribute to state resources for the immediate benefit of the nation. They usually talk about the nation. Sometimes people will talk about citizens of the nation. Now, those aren't the same thing. So again, we get more ambiguity here. So the point I want to make with this slide here, and I'll clarify it as we go through today's lecture, is that we have this incredible ambiguity about how to identify what is resource nationalism. And if you have ambiguity in how to identify it, you cannot use it as an analytical concept, okay? Because people don't know what you're talking about. You have to be consistent. You have to be clear on what is that, all right? Another element that goes into the controversies about definitions of resource nationalism is, does resource nationalism refer not to policy, but only to government ownership of the resource? All right. So governments that raise taxes but don't own the resource, like the United States government when it does raise taxes, that's not resource nationalism. But if you own the resource and you raise taxes, that automatically is resource nationalism. Well, that's not a very good definition, but some scholars use that. All right. So when we're talking about government ownership, we have to think about, are we talking about ownership of the subsoil deposits only? Because these resources are underground. So when they're underground, they belong to the nation. But when they're above ground, do they still belong to the nation? Or do they belong to whoever brought them up out of the ground? That's a controversial aspect of the definition. You can see that play out when you start talking about upstream, which is exploration and production, midstream, which is the processing of these resources, taking that crude oil and making it gasoline, or taking that natural gas and turning it into LNG or propane or whatever, or even downstream. Some people argue that resource nationalism requires downstream control, that the government should own the downstream. What we call downstream is the retail level of the natural resource product. Okay, so there's a bunch of disagreement about that as well. So if you're making a definition of the term and you have all of this disagreement, it's very tough to actually have a consistent analysis. And finally, the other thing I want to point out about defining the terms is ownership is one thing, monopoly is another thing. You can own something, but not have a monopoly in its production, in its transformation, or in its retail sale. But some people argue that in order to have resource nationalism, good or bad, however you approach it, okay, monopoly is required. Okay, free marketers don't believe in monopoly is required for resource nationalism, but some statists are very contradictory about this. If you read what's the debates in Mexico, for example, Mexico, which owns a subsoil resource, Mexico, which has a national oil company, Pemex, okay, which also deals in natural gas, all right. In Mexico, people argue that the national oil company has to have a monopoly on the upstream, on the midstream, and on the downstream. Because if you don't have a monopoly, that's a violation of resource nationalism. Okay, now that Mexican position, okay, would surprise Hugo Chavez. It would surprise Lula. It would surprise Cristina Fernandez. Okay, most Latin American governments today, okay, do not subscribe to the argument that in order to have nationalism over natural resources, you have to monopolize the sector. Mexico is an outlier in that regard. Correa didn't insist on that in Ecuador. Boric today in Chile is not insisting on that. Even the discussions in the Chilean constitution are not insisting on monopoly. Okay, but yet in Mexico, the discussion is still around monopoly. So I want to point out that there is a lot of ambiguity. Okay, and what I do in my book, which is the next talk, all right, what I do in my book is come up with a definition of resource nationalism that I believe is analytically useful. Why is it analytically useful? Because I define it very clearly. Okay? I tell you what it is and what it is not. Okay, I define it very clearly, and when I do that, okay, I make an argument that resource nationalism is a secondary factor in a model of the politics of natural resources policy. So one of the differences in my approach here is that I am not arguing that resource nationalism determines resource policy. I'm arguing that it is a factor that goes into the determination of resource policy. Okay, the political model, all right, is what helps us understand the determinants of that national policy. All right, now I'm not going to talk about the political model, because that model is based on an understanding and a disagreement with the dominant literature on resource nationalism. So it wouldn't do it wouldn't be a very good discussion if I give you the model without telling you what the model's trying to fix. So maybe at some future point I could have another lecture on the model, you know, but you can certainly see the model in the book. There's the cover of the book when it comes out this fall. It's supposed to be out in October. All right. So how do we evaluate resource nationalism's explanatory power? Okay. Again, starting out as an analyst, as a scholar, we need to recognize the difference between description, assertion, and explanation. Much of the literature that you read on natural resources and policy in Latin America, okay, as well as in other places, but we'll be focused on Latin America here. Most of that literature is very descriptive. They simply say, well, resource nationalism is good, and therefore a government that does this or that is doing it because they're resource nationalism, because I agree with it. Or they say resource nationalism is bad, and a government that does X, Y, and Z is a resource nationalist government because I disagree with what they're doing, so I'm calling that resource nationalism. Well, that's not analysis. That is rhetoric. It's description, it's assertion, but it's not explanation. Okay, why isn't it explanation? Okay, because they've not been systematic in defining the concept. They've not been systematic in carrying out an analysis of the dynamics of how this concept is supposed to lead governments to behave in a particular way. If you don't have an explanation of how this drives it, and you don't do an analysis of the evidence that shows you that this is in fact what happens, you don't have an explanation. You have an assertion. My assertion is this is what resource nationalism is, good or bad. Okay, or you have a description. This happened because of resource nationalism. Okay, so ambiguous definition weakens analysis. That's why we have to have a strong, clear definition of what is resource nationalism. And then we need systematic comparative analysis, not anecdotes. What are anecdotes? Well, you know, in Algeria, they did this. In Brazil, they did that. In Chile, they did this. So therefore, we could talk about resource nationalism. All right. Well, those are anecdotes. There's no comparison. Well, look, here's the definition. Here's the way it happened in Algeria, in Brazil, in Chile, in Malaysia, etc. And this is why under this definition, we can see the dynamics that lead to behavior in a particular way. There's none of that. There's just people saying, well, I think it was resource nationalism, so I'm using it as an example. All right, so that doesn't work for claiming explanatory power. Okay, we need quantitative and qualitative research in order to demonstrate the explanatory power of a clearly defined concept of resource nationalism. What does that mean? It means that the variations that we find in policy out there must be explained somehow by this concept of resource nationalism, or the argument that one is using in which resource nationalism is one of a number of causal variables. Okay, you got to tie it back there, not just describe, well, Mexico did it this way, Argentina did it that way, Venezuela did it this way, and they're all resource nationalists. That's not analysis. That's simply an assertion. All right. Variations in outcomes must be explained, not just described. It's not, the literature can't just talk about policy. You have to talk about what are the results of that policy. What are the outcomes of states adopting nationalist perspectives on natural resources? All right. So not just the policies, but what also the outcomes. So now I want to show you that there is tremendous variation in what governments that claim to be nationalists, in what governments that scholars claim are nationalists. Okay, there's tremendous variation in what they wind up doing with policy and the outcomes that they get. All right, so here we can just first look at two things. One is nationalizations of the resource. Okay, the very definition of a nationalization of the resource is also controversial. We used to think nationalization of the resource meant that the resource was under the monopoly control of a national company, of a state-owned company. That's what nationalization means, right? So if you look at the literature in Latin America, where this concept really was first, Africans, Asians, they came to this concept later. Latin America is the leading area for this kind of policy, this kind of analysis, these kinds of claims about the benefits of nationalizations. Here you can see in Argentina, they nationalized a field in 1907. Then they nationalized in 1924 to 27. They went and nationalized some things. Then in 1935, federal government nationalized some regions. In 1936, provinces nationalized other ones. And you can see over here, action reversed in 1993. Argentina reversed the nationalization in 1954, 1958, in 1967. The federal government reversed nationalizations. In 1993, they reversed the privatization of the National Oil Company. In 2012, the government of Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner reversed that privatization of the National Oil Company, but she didn't reverse the nationalization of oil, of subsoil resources. So you get a lot of variation there, back and forth, back and forth. And one of the things that we as analysts have to remember is when you get variations, if you have a strong argument, your argument's got to be able to explain the variations. Okay? What that means is that the drivers in your argument have to explain that. You can't simply go from, well, this government said it was resource nationalist, therefore it nationalized. This government came in and reversed the nationalization, so therefore it wasn't resource nationalist. That's assertion. It's not demonstrating the causal power of that concept. All right, and we can go down, and what I want to demonstrate with this table here is that country after country has changed their policy on nationalizations, as well as on whether the government has a monopoly on that resource when that resource is nationalized. Sometimes it has a monopoly, and sometimes it doesn't have a monopoly. And one of the interesting things, if we go down here to Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, Hugo Chavez is often held up in the 21st century as the prime example, for good or bad. I don't care if you agree with Chavez or disagree with Chavez. The point is, he's usually held up as the best example of resource nationalism in Latin America, because he took those contracts that prior governments in the 90s had allowed private companies to have majority ownership in those contracts. And what Hugo Chavez did was he took those contracts away from those private companies, and he made sure that the National Oil Company had a majority of activity in the contract. Well, think about that. All right. We just gotten through Mexico, and Mexico says it's got to be a monopoly. Hugo Chavez did not go back to the days of a monopoly. Yes, you know, the apertura petrolera in Venezuela, promoted by Carlos Andrés Pérez in his second administration, and followed up by Caldera in his second administration in the early 1990s. They broke the monopoly of PDVSA on oil and gas, okay? But Chavez didn't reinstall the monopoly. Chavez insisted on a majority ownership in oil, okay, for PDVSA in all the contracts. Not a monopoly, just a majority, okay? And in fact, in the case of natural gas, Chavez didn't even require a monopoly in exploration or production, even a majority. He permitted a 100% ownership of the contract by private firms exploring and producing natural gas. Okay, didn't have to be all private, but it could be all private. Okay, so Chavez did that. So there you see, again, variation. And the variation, who's going to call Hugo Chavez an anti-nationalist? Not meant anybody who would call Hugo Chavez an anti-nationalist. But there he is, permitting, you know, by constitution, 49% private ownership of a contract on oil, in practice only up to 40%, but notice 40%, okay? And in the case of natural gas, even 100%. Chavez is much more interested in the midstream and downstream than the upstream in terms of monopoly. Okay, so variation. So any argument about the impact of resource nationalism has to be able to explain these kinds of variations. Otherwise, it's not a good argument. Why? Because these are real variations. They're empirical variations. They happen. And, you know, if you think about Evo Morales's nationalizations of natural gas in Bolivia, okay, 2006, when Morales nationalizes natural gas in Bolivia, the first company, the country that's most affected is Petrobras in Brazil, not a U.S. company or a European company or a Chinese company. No, it's a Latin American company, and it's a state-owned Latin American company. And when Evo Morales nationalizes that, he doesn't insist on a monopoly for YPFB. Petrobras can participate in these contracts. Okay, so there you go again. There's Evo Morales. He is not going to be accused of being an anti-patriota. He's not going to be accused of being anti-nationalist. But there he is, allowing the private enterprise to come in. A very important monopoly. If you put Evo Morales or Hugo Chavez in Mexico City and you have them articulate their policies, and Mexicans would call them traitors to the country, because this is supposed to be a monopoly. This is what the current president, AMLO, is trying to do, is to get rid of that energy reform in 2014 that opened the door for private contracts. He wants to go back to just contracts for the state-owned company, okay, which is not what Chavez or Morales did. All right, other variations, look at these national oil companies. All right. Sometimes countries create national oil companies. Here are the years in which these countries created national oil companies. Okay. These are the years in which they nationalize. If you go through this table, you'll see that very often the NOC is created either before the resource is nationalized or after the resource is nationalized. What does that tell us? Variation. It tells us there is no one-to-one relationship between having a national oil company and nationalizing the resource. Okay, and even when you go upstream, if you have a national oil company, you could have a national oil company and no nationalization upstream. Here are the years, here are the changes. You can see again, I don't want to get into a lot of detail here, but the point of this is again, variation. So your argument has to explain that variation. All right, and then here's another example of variation, a really important example of variation. Private participation in national oil companies. Okay, if you were in Venezuela during Chavez's term, any argument that you were going to sell shares in PDVSA would immediately have made you the subject of claims that you were privatizing the industry in Venezuela, because the national oil company should be in charge, and the national oil company cannot have any private investment in the national oil company. It has to be 100% state-owned. Okay. In Mexico today, that's a big part of the argument. AMLO certainly is a partisan of the idea that you can't sell shares in Pemex. How are you going to let private actors into our national oil company? Okay, but what you can see here is that, in fact, in Argentina, YPF from 1993 to 1999, 41% of their shares were public shares, and anybody could own it, not just Argentines. In 2012, when Cristina renationalized YPF, she didn't renationalize it with 100% shares are owned by the Argentine government. No, 42% of the shares of the renationalized YPF in Argentina are still owned by the public. The public here means by privates, all right, or by other companies, all right? And you don't have to be Argentine to own it. Only 58% of YPF, when it was nationalized in 2012, was owned by the Argentine federal government under Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. And nobody's going to accuse her of being a antipatriota, you know, that oh, she violated nationalism in Argentina. No, they applauded her for doing it. Okay, but if Cristina had gone to Mexico City and said, look, keep 58% of the shares in Pemex and sell the other 42% so you can raise capital for Pemex, she would have been run out of the country as a traitor to Mexico. So again, variation in how people define what is nationalism when we're talking about national oil companies. All right, in Argentina, they have a second national oil company, Enarsa. 35% of their Class C shares are owned by the private sector. In Bolivia, YPFB, 1936, one thing to say here is that Bolivia was the first country in Latin America to nationalize the oil sector. Okay, it wasn't Mexico in 38, it was Bolivia in 36. In 36, they created Bolivia in 37. But in 36, they created this national oil company, YPFB, and they offered shares to the public, but nobody bought them. All right. They offered only Bolivians could buy shares in the company, but no Bolivians wanted to buy shares in the new national oil company. All right. In Bolivia in 1999, they sold 51% of the shares of YPFB. Okay, in Brazil, as you undoubtedly know, in Petrobras in 1999, they sold shares in Petrobras. All right, 68% of the shares at one point, 46% in another. Whoops, sorry, got out of here. All right. In Colombia, 10% of the of Ecopetrol shares after 2007 are held by the private sector. 20% is authorized, but they've only sold 10%. In Mexico, Petromex, 1936, the Cárdenas government, the great nationalist in Mexico who nationalized the industry in 1938, but not as a monopoly. There's not a monopoly in the Mexican oil sector by law until 1958. When Cárdenas nationalized the oil sector in Mexico in 1938, he didn't nationalize all the companies, only the big private companies. So they were still small private companies working in the Mexican oil sector. But before he nationalized the big companies in 1938, he created a Mexican national oil company called Petromex. He created that. 50% of the shares were supposed to be held by the Mexican government, and 50% of the shares were supposed to be held by Mexican private citizens. Okay, but no private citizens in Mexico, just like in Bolivia, wanted to buy shares in this new company. So the company failed. Okay, in Peru, Petroperu, the national oil company, up to 49% of the shares have been authorized to be sold, but none have yet been sold. There is no restriction on those shares only being sold to Peruvians. My suspicion is that we will see in the medium term some shares sold. Okay, why would you sell shares in the national oil company? Not because you want to privatize it, but because you want to raise capital for the company. If you don't raise shares, if you don't sell shares in the company, that means all the company's money has to come from the government. Okay, and the government has to do lots of things. It has to invest in healthcare. It has to invest in education, in infrastructure, etc. So sometimes this is what Cardoso did in Brazil in 1999. You want to raise capital for the national oil company, you sell shares in it. Doesn't mean you lose control of it. In Brazil, even though the majority of the shares in Petrobras are owned by not owned by the Brazilian federal government, the Brazilian federal government retains what are called golden shares. It retains control over the company. Okay, it can't be outvoted on decisions, even though the majority of shares are held by non-federal government. So different ways in which to do this. I go through this in the book, so you can get in there. But again, the point of these tables is just to show you the variation. So any explanation about the importance of resource nationalism has to be clearly defined on what is resource nationalism and has to be able to explain these variations. So let me wrap up with a couple of slides here. If resource nationalism is not determinant of policy, what does determinant mean? It means it determines the policy. Nothing else matters. This is what matters. So that's what a lot of people make arguments about, is that resource nationalism determines policy for good or bad. All right. I argue in the book, it's not determinant of policy. Okay. But if it's not determinant of policy, is it an analytically useless concept? Okay. I argue in the book, no, it's still analytically useful. Why is it analytically useful? And here I'm going to give you my definition of resource nationalism. It's analytically useful because it provides legitimacy that enables governments to do something. It doesn't require that governments do it, but it enables them to do it. Okay, that's an important part of the argument. Okay, the variation is going to be explained, and what governments do is going to be explained not by resource nationalism as determining that variation, but as resource nationalism empowering governments to make different choices. Okay, so let me go through this, and then I'll open it up. The concept of resource nationalism is best conceived as legitimizing certain actions in the name of the nation. It's not simply any action that someone claims is for the good of the nation. Notice I said here, certain actions, okay? So we have to think about what are those actions, okay? Some people claim that anything a government that claims that it's a nationalist government does is by definition in the service of the nation. You get this all the time, okay? Whether it's in Africa, Asia, Latin America, wherever, all right? No, my definition of this concept is not a definition that says anything that a government says it's going to do for the benefit of the nation is resource nationalism. No, I say very specific things have to be done. Okay, so let's look at that. What does in the name of the nation mean? Okay, well, it first of all means that the subsoil resources are owned by the nation. Okay, that's why this is nationalism. The nation owns it. Okay, but that's not enough. Okay, all those countries that we saw that went back and forth on nationalization, on monopolies, on national oil companies, all of those countries owned the subsoil resource. So this is not enough, all right? But it's the starting point. Okay, if you're talking about the United States, where the federal government does and state governments don't own the subsoil resource, U.S. federal government or U.S. state government own the oil and gas underground only on federal property or state property. If it's private property, it's owned by the surface owner. Okay, so this concept of resource nationalism wouldn't be relevant to the United States on those deposits. Okay, but remember, the United States is unique in that era. It's still relevant to Norway, United Kingdom, Latin American countries, African countries, Asian countries, etc. All right, so subsoil resources owned by the nation. Another important thing here to understand when we talk about in the name of the nation, these are non-renewable resources. They're natural resources. They're not renewable resources. They have an end life. They can be consumed. All right. But if they belong to the nation, the future citizens belong to the nation. They are the nation. All right. So the use of these non-renewable resources has to be done in a way that future citizens of the country, future residents of the country will benefit from the use of those resources because they belong to the nation. They don't belong to a particular government. They don't belong to a particular citizen. They don't belong to a particular era of the country. They belong to the nation. They belong to the country. So that means that future citizens have a right to benefit from those resources. That means that the extraction of the wealth of natural resources, if you're going to be a resource nationalist, has to be used efficiently for the long-term benefit of the people living in the nation. Okay, let's take that apart. Okay, efficiently. What do we mean by efficiently? We mean that we get the maximum value out of that resource. We're not wasting resources. Think about what is corruption. Corruption is the waste of resources by the government, by the state government, the local government, or the federal government. It's a waste of those resources that are national resources because they belong to the government. So that's not efficient. So using resource wealth for corruption is betraying resource nationalism. It's not using that wealth for the benefit of the nation. okay? And for the long-term benefit. What do we mean by long-term? We mean not for the next 3 to 5 years, okay? Not for the next 5 to 10 years. Those are definitions of short-term and medium-term. We're talking about the long term. Why the long term? Because these resources belong to the nation. So when you're using those resources, it should be used so that the nation benefits over the long term by the use of these resources. If you sell the resources, the money you get from those resources goes into sustainable national development. Okay, what is that? That's public goods, investment in public goods, not private goods, not partisan goods. So if you say, oh, well, I'm the government, I'm getting, royalties, I'm collecting rents from this, and I'm going to use it for people who support my political party, that's not the benefit of the nation. That's benefiting your partisans. It's not benefiting the nation. Okay, then the resources don't belong to your partisans, they belong to the nation. So the nation should benefit. And how does the nation benefit? The nation benefits through public goods. The definition of public goods ensures that the nation benefits, not particular individuals. Okay, so not corruption, not patronage, and not short-term benefits. Okay, let's have a big party. We all get a big pastel, so we benefited and we run out of money. Okay, running out of money because you misspent that money is not using that money efficiently. You misspent it. You spent it on a lot of projects that had no sustainability. Okay, you spent it on those projects for short-term gain. Okay, you spend it on those projects that would benefit certain groups of people in the country, even if you love those people. It's just certain groups of the people. It's not the nation. Okay, so the definition of resource nationalism then is using the resource that is owned by the nation, okay, efficiently for the long-term benefit of people living in the nation. And the way you can examine that, the way you can test that, is by seeing whether that money is going into the provision of public goods, healthcare, infrastructure, education, okay, and done as national goods, as public goods, not done as private goods. Okay, well, let's make sure that we get a highway just over here in this part of the country because the people who support my party live in this country, part of the country. We're not going to put it over there. That's not a public good. That takes a public good and it turns it into a private good for your partisans. Okay, so if we use this, my argument in the book, okay, is if we define resource nationalism this way, okay, what we get is that the government interfering in the marketplace is legitimate, is recognized as legitimate by the nation, okay, because it is using those resources for the benefit of the nation, which owns the resource. Remember, it's not the government that owns the resource. Hugo Chavez doesn't own the resource. Okay, PSUV in Venezuela doesn't own the resource. The Venezuelan people own the resource. The government is just supposed to be speaking, making policy in the name of the people who own the resource. And that's why, in my argument in the book, okay, resource nationalism is an important variable, okay, but it is not the determinant. The determinant is the model. Let's see if I can get there. The model of politics around resource nationalism. It's not resource nationalism per se, it's the model of the politics that are promoted by this concept of resource nationalism. So how does ownership of the natural resource affect government policy? It affects it, for me, down here through politics. For other people, okay, this is my last slide, I think. For other people, if you want to explain the policy, you look at geological endowments. Resource nationalism, we get a nice definition of it, and then we look at geological endowments. The hypothesis there in those kinds of arguments is the more well-endowed a country is with the natural resource, the more it will intervene. Whoops, where are we here? Okay. The more it will intervene in the market, okay, if it owns the resource. That's a hypothesis that can be tested, all right? And in the book, I test that, all right? I look at geological endowments. When countries have more resources, fewer resources, reserves of oil, reserves of gas, okay? And I show through quantitative and qualitative work that in fact, this hypothesis doesn't work well for explaining the variations that we examine there. Okay, a second kind of argument that's very dominant in the literature, okay, these are the two dominant explanations once you get past it's just resource nationalism, is the market signals argument. That the hypothesis there is that when prices are high, governments intervene in the market because they want as much of the wealth that they can get. Okay, when prices are low, governments provide incentives to attract private investment because governments can't provide the necessary investment to exploit the resource. So there, it's market signals via prices that determines that variation, all right, in resource nationalist countries. Okay, again, in the book, I go through the variations in prices, okay, and I demonstrate again through quantitative and qualitative analysis that this isn't a very good explanation for variations in public policy or in outcomes. So then my argument, which is a politics argument, no surprise since I'm a political scientist, okay, I build a model of politics that looks at the interests of politicians and the institutional framework of the political system within which those politicians operate, okay, to explain the variations in policy and ultimately the variations in outcomes. When you get good outcomes, when you get bad outcomes. So in my argument, which I won't go through here, but we could talk about it in the question period, and it's in the book. In my argument, resource nationalism, okay, is a factor that empowers politicians to make certain types of arguments. But what those politicians will argue about policy, okay, is determined by the inclusiveness of the political system. The broader your political system is, the more varying voices in there. If you want to use the jargon, I don't really use it in the book. I talk about inclusiveness using polity database to determine the level of inclusiveness. Some people use democracy or non-democracy. Okay, for shorthand, we could use that. You could say the more democratic a system is, democracy understood as allowing competing groups to compete for power, allowing competing voices to run for office, having a free and fair election that would determine who's the politician who is elected to the National Assembly, to the state governorship, to the presidency, etc. All right. For me, inclusiveness is allowing more of that diversity in the political system. And the basic argument is an argument that people have made in comparative politics for a long time, is that the more inclusive, the more voices you have to benefit, the more likely you're going to make public goods. You're going to invest in public goods. Why? Because there isn't enough money out there in governments to attract. If you have a broad electorate, there's not enough money to give everybody in the electorate specific goods for them. So if you provide public goods, more people are benefiting. Okay. Well, if you provide public goods, this is in my argument in the book, if you provide public goods, then you're going to be more careful in the policy that you use for the oil and gas sector. Why? Because you need the oil and gas sector to fund public goods, not to fund private goods. Okay, you could, and we have a history in Latin America of this. If you're a politician who was president or dictator, and you don't have to please very many people, you can run the oil and gas industry into the ground, but you take the money that's there and you give it to your partisans. You give it to the people who support you, whether it's the military people or a particular political party people or whatever. But it takes less money to do that than to provide public goods. So either you have a lot of money and you provide the public goods, you have an open system, or you have less money, you can't provide public goods, but you got to close down the system so that those people who are not getting private goods can't overthrow you, can't elect you out of the system. So you got to close that system down. So that inclusiveness of the political system is a really fundamental opening piece of my model. Okay, my model is a political economy model that takes place within the context of a country's geological endowments and what's happening in the international market for the resource. Okay, but those are contextual variables. They're not the driving variables that explain politicians' behavior. The variables that explain that behavior are institutional variables in the political system. First, in the broader political system. Secondly, in what I call in the book, the decision-making units in a political democracy. That decision-making unit is the National Assembly or the Parliament or the Congress, depending on the country. So the competitiveness in the Congress matters, again, for the same kinds of reason. The more you are competing to provide benefits, the more likely you're going to provide public goods. Okay, and then the third variable in my model are the personal characteristics of the president, of the political leader, in terms of willingness to take risks and being innovative in their policy making. I won't explain how that model works. I'll tell you that it works well in the book, so you can look there. But let me give you a nice little sort of tickle, if you will. In the book, I look at four presidencies in Venezuela: the second administration of Carlos Andrés Pérez, the second administration of Caldera, the various administrations of Chavez, and then the first governments of Maduro. I classify the presidents in terms of their willingness to accept risk, in terms of their innovativeness. And I go through I have two general chapters looking at Venezuela's history in that period, their economy in that period. And then I have a chapter on Punto Fijo governments, which are Pérez and Caldera, and then the Bolivarian governments, which are Chavez and Maduro. And I go through there and analyze their policy towards the oil and gas sector. And one of the interesting things is that I came away, I didn't realize this before I started the study, but it's really interesting to compare Hugo Chavez in that 1999, once he takes office, 1999 to 2010 years of his government, with the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez from 1989, when he was elected for his second term, to 1993, when he's impeached, to look at their oil and gas policies. And what you'll see is that the policies themselves are not all that different. Okay, so a lot of what Carlos Andrés Pérez was trying to do in Venezuela was to break that monopoly of PDVSA in order to bring in technology and capital. Okay, he was not turning the sector over to the private, the oil and gas sector over to the privates. He was bringing them in so that they would help PDVSA carry these things out. Okay, and he was denounced as a traitor and whatnot in '89, and ultimately impeached in '93, largely because people didn't agree with a lot of his policies, but in particular the Apertura Petrolera. But if you look at Bolivarian nationalism in the oil sector in 1999 to 2000 and roughly 2010, it looks very similar to Carlos Andrés Pérez's Apertura Petrolera. Not Caldera's Apertura Petrolera, but yes, Pérez's Apertura Petrolera. Chavez did not throw out the private sector. In fact, Chavez went one step further than Pérez. Chavez allowed the private sector to have up to 100% national, 100% control of natural gas. Pérez didn't even contemplate that, but Chavez did. Why? Because PDVSA had no ability to exploit, to explore for or exploit natural gas offshore. It was not a company that knew how to do that. So they needed help. They needed help. But when Chavez's government passes the natural gas law in 2001, Venezuela doesn't have a lot of money. Okay, so they don't have the money to give PDVSA so PDVSA can go out there and learn how to do this, or hire people away from Petrobras or Statoil or Chevron and bring them to PDVSA to teach PDVSA how to do this. They didn't have the money for that. So Chavez said, well, we need to have these things exploited. So let's have 100%. Now, that's of the exploration and production. Once you get down to selling that on the market, well, there Chavez does insist on national control, but not in the exploration and production. So, I think my book has two really interesting components to it, and I'll end with this. One is, I think I rehabilitate the concept of resource nationalism so that it can be an analytically useful concept. And the second is I show that even the big revolutionaries of oil and gas, Hugo Chavez, Correa, Morales, okay, even they bring in the private sector to help the national oil companies do things because they understand they don't have the capital to do it with national money, and they don't have the expertise. That's a big lesson for a country like Mexico, which continues to insist on we should be able to do it all ourselves. Okay, if we don't have the money, the government needs to give Pemex that money. They don't think about what does it mean to give Pemex that money. It means you take it away from education. It means you take it away from infrastructure. It means you take it away from healthcare. Why? Because the Mexican government can't just print money and give it to Pemex. And then Pemex is not a very efficient company. Okay, it ruins oil wells. Okay, that gigantic oil field that they had, one of the biggest oil fields in the world, Pemex destroyed that oil well by over exploiting it. by not paying attention to the maintenance that was needed. Why? Because the government kept telling Pemex, you need to export more oil because we need more money, because we need to do this, that, and the other. And Pemex couldn't say no because it was governed by the government. Okay, and they went out there and they overexploited. Cantarell was the name of that gigantic oil field, and they destroyed it. And Mexico lost in the long term. So, you know, back then, I was living as a professor in Mexico back in those days. You know, back then, everybody was saying, oh, this is resource nationalism. This is for the benefit of the country. You know, we need this because we need the money to do that and the other thing. Right? More healthcare, free education, et cetera, et cetera. So we got to pump more oil out of Cantarell, you know. Well, that was a short-term view. It wasn't resource nationalism, according to my definition, which I think is the only definition that's out there that is consistent, that is clear, okay, and that can be used analytically in an analytically useful way. So let me leave it there, open it up to questions. Se querem falar no português, posso entender sempre quando vocês falam devagar. So thank you.
Thank you, David, for your lecture. Now the question of the public. Rogelio, no sé si ya tiene algunas perguntas.
Não, ainda não, Rafael, mas podemos começar com as suas, se você quiser.
Bom, está bom. David, en español. David, excelente tu trabajo de investigación, ¿no? Y necesario ese trabajo tuyo de investigación. Yo veo que tú enfatizas mucho en las variaciones, ¿no? En las variaciones. Ahora yo me pregunto si hay en los gobernantes latinoamericanos, ¿no? Más contemporáneos. Agarremos, por ejemplo, las 2 primeras décadas del siglo XXI, ¿no? Si hay algún padrón, no una variación, si hay algún padrón entre nacionalismo y recursos naturales, ¿no? Por lo menos en algunas, en algún issues, en algunas, algunos sectores, ¿no? Yo, por ejemplo, estoy pensando por ejemplo, en cómo Chile, ¿no? Utiliza parte de las exportaciones del cobre para destinarlas a compras de armamentos, ¿no? De sus fuerzas armadas. 10%, ¿no? De las exportaciones del cobre, ¿no? Son destinadas a compra de armamento, inversión, capitalización mismo, ¿no? De armamentos. Y así, a mí me llamó mucho la atención que durante la primera década y también la segunda década, ¿no? Para algunos países sudamericanos utilizaron el gran boom de los commodities, ¿no? Gas, petróleo, soya, el propio cobre, ¿no? El propio cobre, que subió mucho, ¿no? Subió mucho en la primera, para comprar armas, ¿no? Para comprar armas. En Chile, bueno, en Chile ya tenía la del cobre, ¿no? Pero Bolivia lo hizo, ¿no? Con la subida del gas. Venezuela lo hizo, ¿no? Compró, por ejemplo, los Sukhoi 30 de Rusia. Ecuador de Correa también, ¿no? Compró bastante armamento. Y Brasil también compró, ¿no? No se puede decir que ciertamente fue de los commodities como minerales y soya, ¿no? Pero lo hizo. Entonces, así, yo me quedé pensando aquí, si hay algún padrón también por lo menos en algunos issues, en algunos sectores, en algunos sectores, ¿no? En el discurso de gobernantes latinoamericanos, ¿no? Y en las prácticas, ¿no? Las prácticas. Cuando ellos usan los recursos naturales para beneficiar a ciertos sectores.
Sí, bueno, buena pregunta. Yo creo que podemos definir la política de defensa como un bien público, un public good, ¿okay? Cuando la nación se enfrenta retos por el lado militar, en donde los recursos militares pueden ser utilizados para defender la nación. ¿Okay? Dos cosas ahí. Primero, tiene que haber retos militares, ¿sí? Y segundo, la compra de armamento tiene que ser armamento apropiada para enfrentar ese reto militar. Por ejemplo, si un país tiene un reto militar por un vecino o un poder extranjero que que se basa en la capacidad de lanzar misiles al territorio nacional, ¿no? Entonces, comprar tanques para disuadir el uso de misiles del otro, si no es un país vecino, colindante, no tiene sentido. O sea, compras los tanques para que los oficiales en el ejército puedan jugar con tanques. Eso no es un bien público. Pero si gastas el dinero en comprar un sistema antiaéreo, eso sí, y es un bien público, si enfrentas ese reto. Entonces, si vamos a Chile con la ley cobre, el 10% del cobre, esa ley se pasó, se hizo en el 58. En el 58, Chile y Argentina todavía tenían roces fronterizos, tenían desacuerdos grandes acerca de dónde estaba la frontera, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, tenía sentido poder tener fuerzas armadas en Chile que pudiesen enfrentar a Argentina si es que Argentina decidiera utilizar la fuerza militar en contra de Chile, que Chile es un país con una población mucho menos que la Argentina, ¿no? Entonces, muchos puntos ahí. Entonces, se decidió en el 58, cuando Chile era una democracia, ¿sí? Que el 10%, en vez de poner una, eh, un porcentaje del presupuesto nacional para compra de armamentos, dijeron, bueno, pues la compra de armamentos será por parte de las ganancias del cobre, punto. No vamos a comprar más armamentos de lo que podemos reunir del 10%, ¿no? Ese tenía sentido en 58. Cuando ya la idea de un reto de Argentina no tiene sentido, cuando el reto de Perú y Bolivia no tiene sentido, entonces todavía tener el 10% del cobre para el armamento, eso ya no es bien público. Ese es un bien privado para las Fuerzas Armadas, ¿no? Pero, como digo, depende del contexto. En el 77 y 78, Chile sembró minas en su territorio junto a Perú y Bolivia, porque los peruanos y los bolivianos se movilizaron para disputar territorio en el norte de Chile, que sí, históricamente sí sabemos que hace 100 años eran parte de Perú y Bolivia, ¿no? Pero en ese contexto tiene sentido tanto para Bolivia, para Perú, para Chile, hablar de armamento necesario, ¿no? Y gastar en armamentos como un bien público. Pero en esa zona, en este momento, no existen esos retos. Entonces, eso ya no tiene sentido de bien público. Pudiera quizás en el futuro, pero en esta era, no. ¿Ok? Colombia, pues Colombia tiene una frontera con Venezuela, no sabemos qué va a pasar con Venezuela. Yo diría que sería irresponsable por el gobierno colombiano no tener fuerzas armadas que pudiesen defenderse si es que Venezuela decidiera utilizar todo ese nuevo armamento que ha comprado con el boom de los commodities, ¿no? Entonces ahí eso sí sería un bien público, ¿no? Pero otra vez voy a las variaciones. El hecho de que uno gaste o no gaste, no define si esto es en realidad nacionalismo de recursos naturales. Depende en qué se gasta. Y para evaluar en qué se gasta, uno tiene que saber cuál es el contexto. Si uno gasta en escuelas primarias en donde los niños salen y en realidad no saben sumar, no saben escribir, pero fueron a la escuela, ¿no? Todos los días le dieron comida, etcétera. Pues eso no es usar los recursos nacionales en educación de manera eficiente para para una política educativa, ¿no? Entonces, uno tiene que hacer el análisis de para qué, cómo, y viendo el resultado, para saber si en realidad este dinero que sale de la explotación de recursos naturales en realidad está siendo utilizado para el bien nacional. Uno no puede solamente decir, el gobierno dice que es nacionalista, el gobierno lo gasta, algunos se benefician y por lo tanto este es el uso de esos recursos para el bien nacional. Uno tiene que analizarlo y ver si se está utilizando de manera eficiente, si se está utilizando para los bienes públicos y no solo para patriotas de algún partido político.
Gracias, David.
Rafael, temos uma pergunta do Vicente. David, we have a question from Vicente Ferraro, our PhD candidate. Thank you very much for the presentation. In your opinion, why were there no national takers in the case of Mexico and Bolivia, when their governments allowed private shares in the state-owned oil companies? This is a question from Vicente Ferraro.
Okay, very good question. Very good question. And again here, what we need to do is look at the evidence from the case. All right. So remember I said geological endowments and market signals are part of the context within which the model works. Okay. So if we go to, let's start with Bolivia. We go to Bolivia in 1936. Okay. The big oil company in Bolivia is Standard Oil. Okay. There are other companies there, but Standard Oil is the big company. And the problem for Bolivia, as it is for Mexico, is that Standard Oil is beginning to disinvest. Okay, it's beginning to not put money into exploration and production of oil in Bolivia. Okay, now why is Standard Oil doing this? Okay, because they are now putting their money in Venezuela, because you can get the cost of production of oil in Venezuela is very cheap. Okay, Bolivia has run out of its easy oil. If you want to find oil in Bolivia, you have to explore in new parts of the country that are difficult to get to, that nobody knows if there really is oil down there, and nobody knows how much oil is down there. By 1936, Venezuela is the #1 oil producing country, or not country, but exporter in the world. Okay, there's lots of oil in Venezuela. Okay, so the companies know that if they invest in Venezuela, they are going to find oil. Okay, so that's why Standard Oil and other companies are beginning to disinvest out of Bolivia. So in this market context, in this geological context, the Bolivian government says, well, let's create a national oil company. This national oil company is going to invest its money, the money that it raises, okay, in exploring for oil in Bolivia. Okay, so now let's go to the Bolivian people. Okay, who are going to buy shares in the company? Not a poor illiterate peasant. Okay, one, they don't know anything about oil and national companies or anything. Two, they don't have any money. So the shares would be sold to the small middle class that existed in Bolivia at the time, and the elite, okay, who have a lot of money. Okay, now put yourselves in their shoes. You're a tin baron. You're making money on the tin market. All right, you're an international businessman. That's what the tin barons were in Bolivia. Were international business people. They know how markets work. They know what companies do. All right, and you look over and you see that Standard Oil and the other international oil companies are not investing in exploration and production of oil in Bolivia. And you ask yourself, well, why aren't they doing that? And you tell yourself, well, because they don't think there's a lot of oil here. Okay, there's not a lot of oil here. And if there's oil here, it's going to be hard to find and therefore expensive. So this is what happened in the Bolivian and Mexican cases. Same thing happened in Mexico. The oil companies are beginning to disinvest in Mexico. Okay, that means not explore for more oil, not explore, not produce more oil, even when you have some oil there, because it's high cost oil, and Venezuelan oil is really cheap. So the Mexican government says, well, let's create a national company, and the national company will do this. And what we'll do is we'll sell shares of the national company to Mexican citizens. Okay, well, if you're a poor Mexican peasant, you don't have money to buy a share. So they're not talking to you. Okay, they're talking to the small middle class and the elite. And the small middle class and the elite are saying, why should I invest in such a risky endeavor? Okay, and in fact, if you look at what happened in Bolivia and Mexico, they were right. After 1938, okay, in Mexico, Pemex is the big oil producer, but they never find a lot of oil. They produce barely enough oil for domestic purposes. And by the beginning of the 1970s in Mexico, they're running out of oil. Their reserves are dwindling down to very close to having to import oil in order to run their refineries. Okay, well, they find Cantarell. Well, actually, Pemex does not find Cantarell. Cantarell is there. It's one of the super mega fields, an easy field, shallow water. It looks like one of the Saudi fields, cheap to exploit, gigantic. It has billions of barrels in it. Pemex couldn't find it. Okay, who found it? A fisherman. Mr. Cantarell, Senor Cantarell, is out fishing one day and he sees all this oil on the water. So he comes back into shore and he goes to complain to Pemex. Hey, you guys must have spilled a bunch of water where I'm fishing. Stop that. And the people at Pemex say, well, gee, no, we don't have any oil spills out there. So let's go take a look. So then Pemex goes out and takes a look and they say, my God, this is oil and it's popping up from underground by itself. Let's start drilling here. And then they find a super major field. Okay? But that shows you the extent of Pemex's capacity. They never developed the capacity. Now, Petrobras is really interesting because Petrobras developed the capability of being a world-class oil company. Petrobras, in many respects, was like and will become again like Statoil, now Equinor in Norway. Okay, an oil company that really does operate as an oil company. How did they do that? Well, the Brazilian government, the military government, let Petrobras associate with private companies in international exploration. And what Petrobras did was learn. So they were drilling with the private major international oil companies all over the world. And in partnering with them, they were learning. And they brought that knowledge back to Brazil. They created a world-class engineering school for petroleum engineers. Okay, they took what they learned and they built on that. And then Petrobras became one of the leading companies in deep water exploration. Pemex can't even explore today in medium deep water. And there's Petrobras exploring in ultra deep water. Okay, Pemex was never allowed to operate as an oil company. It was simply a state company that had to do what the government wanted and how the government wanted it to do it. So it never partnered internationally. It never learned anything. Okay, so that's the story of why when Bolivia in 36 and Mexico in 36 says, let's have a national oil company, you Mexicans, you Bolivians invest in it, they said, this is not a way in which we want to invest our money. And the Mexican government and the Bolivian government also said, well, this is not a way we want to invest our money. This is a very risky enterprise. Okay, we don't want to go out there and look for new oil, because when those two governments created the national oil companies, they hadn't nationalized the private companies yet, so they weren't going to take the new company and take over the wells of the private company. The goal of the new company, the new state company, was to go out and find new oil. Okay, once you take the wells of the private company, well, then you look good, because all you're doing is you're exploiting the well of the new company. And Pemex did that fairly well. They did the wells that Standard Oil and Shell had there until those wells ran out. And when those wells ran out of oil, then Mexico began to suffer because Pemex couldn't explore for new oil in geologically difficult places. Okay, so that's the story. The lesson out of that is finding oil is not easy. Finding oil is not cheap. Okay, finding oil takes a lot of capital and it's risky. So a government has to decide, is this the way we want to use our resources, or do we want to partner with somebody and have them use their resources and then get the benefits of it? This is what Chavez and Evo Morales both did. They partnered with foreign firms for the foreign firms to do the hard work, okay? And then they taxed them, they charged them royalties. In some cases, they took over their wells, okay? But it wasn't PDVSA and it wasn't YPFB that did the exploration and the first wells out of those areas, because those governments were smart enough to know this was too risky, too much money.
Other question, David. Fernando asks, do you have any comment to make about how politicians in Latin America mobilize the exploitation or presentation of flores like the Amazon? In nationalist discourse, Bolsonaro is an example of a president who defends the exploitation of the Amazon.
Yeah.
The Amazon
Okay.
mobilizing the idea that it is a national resource that should generate a public good.
Right. Another excellent question. These are not subsoil resources, so in that sense, they're a little different than the resources that I look at, the natural resource that I look at. But we can still use the model to think about that. All right. The place to start, all right, is yes, they are natural resources. Okay. They are resources in areas owned by the nation. All right. The question is, can you exploit them efficiently for the benefit of the nation? And this gets us into the discussion about climate change and the contribution of Brazil to either the mitigation of climate change or the solution to the problem of climate change. You know, the question here is how do Brazilians, okay, how do Brazilians see the use of that resource for the benefit of Brazil? All right. If we say Brazil has an open political system, okay, which it does, all right, we have a way for Brazilians to make their decisions about the Amazon. And it's not Bolsonaro. When Lula was president, Lula's government defended the building of these big dams in the Amazon. What was the name of that super big dam? I forgot the name. But the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights had said that the rights of the indigenous people had been violated in the area through the construction of this dam. And the Lula government said, this is a Brazilian question. It's not an inter-American question. And we'll build that dam if we want. So it's not Bolsonaro who's saying the Amazon is a national resource. Okay, it's Brazilian governments saying that, presumably in response to what Brazilian citizens are telling the government what they wanted. Okay, if we had massive protests, if we had the voting out of the PT when Lula said, you know, we are going to build these dams in the Amazon, because destroying the Amazon isn't just cutting down trees, it's also building the dams. Building large-scale dams is bad for climate change. It takes up, you chop down a bunch of trees, it releases all the carbon that was in those trees. It gets rid of the carbon capture of the trees. Okay, it creates a lot of sediment behind the big dam walls. Okay, that sediment destroys vegetation, which releases carbon, etc. So one could accuse the Lula government in the first decade of the 20th century of also saying the Amazon is a national resource that should be used for the benefit of Brazilians. So it's not for me to say whether it should be used or not. I think Brazil has a good political system in terms of inclusiveness, and Brazilians should be able to make that decision. Look, Norwegians are making the decision about whether they should explore for more natural gas right now. Natural gas, it isn't just a hydrocarbon that sets out carbons. It also produces methane, which is a bad gas for climate change. But nobody's telling the Norwegians, hey, you can't produce more natural gas. They're saying that's a Norwegian decision. Well, the Amazon should be a Brazilian decision. I would hope that Brazilians would decide that the energy needs could be met by wind and solar, and we don't need to destroy the Amazon. But that's a decision that Brazilians will have to make. It's not for me or for others to make.
Rafael?
No temos mais perguntas.
Posso fazer uma? Posso
mais
fazer uma? David, you talked about the importance of explanation beyond the description, okay? Mm-hmm. So can we test your hypothesis in a large numbers way?
Certainly.
Quantitative way, have you tried to do it?
I have done the qualitative testing by operationalizing my variables. So I do have quantitative indicators for my variables, but my variables require building the database. There isn't a readily available database out there, but I've given scholars the variables in the model, how to code the variables, and as scholars take that model, code the relevant variables for the different countries, then we'll be able to do a large scale quantitative test. But you do have to build the database, and I can tell you, having done the database for Venezuela from 89 to 2016, which is only 18 years. Okay. It took me a lot of work, and I had 6 graduate students working with me on that. And so I'm offering my book out there as a way to begin to be systematic about these kinds of questions, and demonstrating how one can build databases for it. Other scholars can use my model, or they can come up with their own model and variables, and collect the data for the variables in their model. Okay, but yes, I entirely agree with you. We need to be able to not just have qualitative studies. I've got one country, but across 4 different presidential administrations, 2 different political systems, Punto Fijo, and then the Bolivarian one. And in the conclusion, I give you a little bit of exposure to Colombia under Uribe to show that the model isn't specific to Venezuela. We can look at how those variables in the model were classified in the years of the Uribe government. And I've set out the hypotheses in the book. Okay, you know, what would happen if the variables had these values on them and across the model, what you should expect to see in oil and gas policy in terms of access to the resource, in terms of government take on the resource, in terms of national policy towards the national oil company. So there are hypotheses there, and then I test them. But I test them qualitatively for Venezuela using the quantitative data, and I show you briefly in the conclusion how Colombia could do it. I initially started this book 15 years ago, trying to do 7 Latin American countries. And I've done a lot of other publications on other topics in the 17 years. But finally, I decided I need to get this book out. So I'll limit myself to Venezuela with a brief discussion of Colombia only under Uribe to stimulate discussion. You know, I'm quite happy for people to say Maris's argument is wrong, okay, for the following reasons. And here's the evidence. Okay, for people to say Maris's argument is wrong because I don't like it. Well, that's not scholarship. People say Maris's argument is wrong because you know, I have a model and I think it works well. Well, that's better, but it's still not good. The best way to show that Maris's argument is wrong is to show me that the model is not producing, you know, is not in line with the hypotheses that have been developed, or that you have a better model that's more parsimonious, that uses better, has more precision on its explanatory variables, and that model does much better than my model on explaining variations. So there's 2 ways that I could be critiqued, and I think a respectable scholarship way. And I'm looking forward to that because, you know, I want to learn too. You know, it took me 17 years because when I first started, you know, my ideas about what was going on were wrong because I didn't really understand the history. I had to do a lot of work on the history, not just in Venezuela, but the history of the other Latin American countries, because I do have a chapter in the book that from which these tables that I presented today, those are drawn from a chapter in the book, which is a historical chapter simply designed to show that there is variation, lots of it. It doesn't explain it, but it shows it's a variation, because lots of times people will say, there's no variation. You know, the people who are nationalists always do it this way for good or bad. Okay, and the people who are anti-nationalists, they always do it this other way, again, for good or bad, doesn't matter. Okay, that chapter in the book, an early chapter in the book, shows you that that's not a good explanation because it doesn't correspond to the historical reality of oil and gas policy in Latin America. And there I do look at 9 different countries, not just Venezuela, but 9 different countries over, really over, because the historical chapter starts in the 1850s, because Latin American countries were producing oil and gas in the 1850s already, mainly oil. So I've got over 100 years of history and across 9 countries as the historical background.
David, una pregunta rapidilla y así que más una pregunta de coyuntura, ¿no? Porque tú dices en el libro, ¿no? Que cuando los precios de commodities, recursos naturales, están altos, ¿no? El gobernante deja de lado a la iniciativa privada, ¿no? Y cuando están bajos, ¿no? estimula, ¿no?, alguna alianza con la iniciativa privada. Pero
bueno, ese es la hipótesis, de los analistas que dicen que el determinante de la política son los precios. Y yo evalúo ese argumento y yo digo que no es así. Pero es el argumento
porque
que
fíjate
muchos utilizan.
Que Maduro, estando los precios altos del petróleo en este momento, ¿no?, está loco para que la iniciativa privada, la Chevron, ¿no?, vuelva para Venezuela, ¿no? Y los precios están altos. Y los precios comenzaron a estar altos, no con la guerra, con la guerra de Ucrania, era de antes. David, thank you very much, no? Very good, no? Your lecture, the answer.
Obrigado.
Y nos esperamos que en el futuro, ¿no?, tú puedas venir aquí a Brasil, a la USP, en alguna manera más institucionalizada, como profesor visitante o algo. Nos encantaría.
Ajá. Bueno, es para considerar. Sí, definitivamente.
Bueno, vamos a hablar en el futuro entonces sobre eso.
Ok, bueno, pues espero que para los estudiantes haya sido estimulante la discusión.
Muy estimulante, muy estimulante.
Muito.
Rogério.
Muito obrigado, David. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.
Thank
De nada.
you. Bueno.